Alasdair, can you hear us? Alasdair, can you hear us?
Can you not hear me?
We hear you fine now.
I can hear you.
Great, wonderful.
Good.
Okay, so I'd like to introduce the last speaker of the conference, who will close our conference. This is Alasdair Phillips from the UK. And he's going to be telling us some interesting ideas. And he's from Powerwatch, which is an NGO, which is also following very closely the aspects of 5G and cellular positions in the UK. So let's hear about separating hype from reality.
Thank you. So you can hear me fine now, can you?
Yes, we can. You can.
Yes, good. I can't foresee how to get the software I'm using, which I only downloaded an hour ago, into a bigger thing. Is the slide big enough?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, good. Okay. Right. Let's go on to the next slide. Actually, I'll go back. I'd just like to comment on a bit of Amir's thing, because in fact about the spectrum analyzer being taken to a school and not detecting the Wi-Fi. Back in 2002 or 3, after the Stewart report on, in the UK, the IUGMP report on whether cell phone and this type of radiation is harmful, I was on a small group of about 20 people with chaired by Sir William Stewart, Bill Stewart, who chaired the inquiry. And he got the main expert from the Health Protection Agency on how to measure microwaves to come and put his £100,000 worth of equipment in the end of the room and demonstrate. And he said, I can see like there's no Wi-Fi here. And I'd got one of my pocket meters, and I said, well, no, sorry, there is Wi-Fi. So we had a bit of an argument, and then at lunchtime I went over, and he'd set it up exactly as Amir said. The resolution bandwidth and the video bandwidth was such that he completely didn't see the quite high levels of Wi-Fi that were in the room that we were sitting in. And this is somebody that was actually advising the government in the UK about how to measure these things. So it is a big issue, and I quite agree with a lot of Amy was saying. I'll just do a very quick thing about who I am, because you probably don't know. I'm qualified in electronic engineering and agriculture. I've spent 50 years working in industry and government, R&D. I thought wireless was wonderful. At the age of 11, I made my first radio, and then in the 80s, I investigated military microwave non-lethal weapon technologies and actually experienced them at Greenham Common Air Base. The USAF Air Force was experimenting with them. Since then, I've followed the issue very carefully. I'm a research director of a small company that makes meters, designs and makes meters. I'm also a trustee of a major UK charity with responsibility for overseeing our funding for research into the causes of cancer. And we fund about an extra £5 million sterling each year into cancer research. And I'm particularly interested in cause. And in 2018, I was the lead author of a paper that showed aggressive and fatal glioblastoma multiforms were rising, particularly in temporal and frontal lobes of people. I think RF is actually probably more promoter than an initiator of cancer, but come on to that. Right, 5G. What is 5G? 5G, this is a diagram, International Telecommunications Union diagram. It's intended to be a multi-level system that can transfer large bandwidth data right through to low bandwidth Internet of Things data, which is actually quite slow. You don't need, if your washing machine's talking to your fridge or something, you don't need a lot of data. It can go really quite slowly. But 5G is clearly intended to replace a whole range of current communication systems. 3G will disappear, it's disappearing anyway. 4G LTE will continue for the time being. But it's a very complex system, 5G, and it's actually going to make measurement, particularly in the field, incredibly difficult. Here's 5G new radio main parameters. And why it's going to make it so difficult is the bandwidth per carrier. All those are options, all from 5 megahertz bandwidth per carrier to 400 megahertz. And this is spread spectrum signal. So you've not got nice clean pulses. It's actually darting about throughout the 5, 10 or up to 400 megahertz bandwidth. So it's a noise signal. It looks like a noise signal. It's very difficult to measure. The data rates at the low band, this is at up to 6 gigahertz, primarily 3 to 5 gigahertz. But in fact, they go down to, we come on to the frequencies in a minute. Data rates are 300 megabits a second to 600 megabits a second. And in the what have been called millimeter wave frequencies, the main band that's going to be used to start with is actually 24 gigahertz to 29.5. There's various sections of that in different countries. That isn't actually strictly millimeter waves. Millimeter waves strictly start at 30 gigahertz, but it's being described as millimeter waves. And there we've got 1 or 2 gigabit per second data rate, very fast. To make it even harder to measure, there are 4 different types of modulation systems that are going to be used. Now, these CRAM systems are incredibly difficult to measure. Instead of you getting a pulse, you have a sine wave that jumps about in phase. So instead of having a nice sine wave, it goes up so many degrees and then it jumps to a completely different part on the sine wave. And then it does it again, and then it does it again, very, very fast. And the edges are very sharp. They're almost femtosecond edges to the signal change. And the induced EMF or induced current in a conductive body and a human body is dependent on the rate of change of the signal. So the faster the edges of the signal, the higher the induced currents and induced voltages will be in the tissue. So but it also means it's very difficult to measure with most modern electronics. It's too fast. It actually is becoming very difficult for a handheld broadband meter to measure anything like this. One of the better semi-professional ranges of meters is made by a German firm called Gigahertz Solutions. And they say that 4G and 5G, well, 4G they're only talking about, but it has similar problems. Their meters can underread by a factor of 10-fold. So really 5 or 10, because it's not going to be able to measure the spread spectrum sharp edge signal properly. So I'll go on to the next one. One very worrying thing for me in 5G is back in GSM 2G phones, we were all used to the noise you'd get if you had your phone near a radio or television or hi-fi system. You get a kind of bleep-bleep, bleep-bleep, bleeping noise. And that was because it pulsed out. It had one slot out of 8 every time period, which was 217 times a second. So every 217 times a second, it would put a pulse of data out, and then there'd be 7 gaps of the same length. So its Mark space ratio would be 1 in 8. And that was a very pulsatile signal, which again induces more changes in a living system, well, in anything, but particularly a living system. Now, 3G got rid of that almost completely. 4G brought a little bit of it back, but 5G is going back primarily in many of its implementations to a time domain multiplex system. So you've got one frequency and the phone and the base station are both using the same frequency. So we've got downlink, that's a reserved frame, uplink, downlink, reserved, uplink, downlink. So it's actually putting bursts of these very nasty shit out with ketamine, which is likely to be, these more pulsatile signals are likely to be more bioactive. And again, quite difficult to measure. I noticed in the cell aid things, the time of day was important. And it is because the amount of radiation the mast gives out, and this goes from 3G onwards, really, and the phone gives out. They have a conversation with each other. For 3G, it was 1,500 times a second. They could turn up or turn down the level, and the power level control on your phone and the power level control on the base station for your call is about 1,000,000 to 1. It never actually gets there. It's more like 1,000 to 1 in practice. But actually, the actual control is about 1,000,000 to 1. So if you're very near if you've got a femtocell and you've got a modern phone, it will expose you 1,000-fold less than a Wi-Fi router and a Wi-Fi connection will do, because it turns its power down, whereas currently Wi-Fi doesn't do that. So there are a few upmarket Wi-Fi systems that aren't put into homes that do some level of power control, both at the device and at the access point, but most don't. So this is going to be difficult to measure. Now, there's a slide of Deborah that showed, it's quite a nice one, of spectrum, so I've popped it in here. All EMFs are biologically active. Now, what's not really considered enough, I don't think, is where are we doing this? Where is this? I hope you're still there. I'm getting a message with an unstable connection. Are you still there?
Yeah, we're still
here. Yeah.
We're getting distorted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. Yes.
All right, I'll speak a bit slower. Yes. Here's a graph of RF noise on the Earth. So we've got galactic noise here at 100 megahertz or gigahertz coming in from outside the planet system. Cosmic fireball floor noise. There's virtually no noise between 70 megahertz and gigahertz and about 12 gigahertz, and then from 10 gigahertz onwards, we're getting noise from the Earth, molecular noises and resonance noises. We've got water there, oxygen there at 60 gigahertz, another water resonance there. So this is Earth's atmospheric noise. So where we've put cell phones and Wi-Fi is in this cosmic noise floor. So 100 years ago, there was really nothing there. Literally, there was nothing there. It was and where 5G is going in the millimeter wave bands is in the region where we're getting molecular resonances and molecular absorptions. And there's even a Wi-Fi band that is now allowed at around 60 gigahertz, which is an oxygen resonance, which just seems completely balmy to me to plan your systems like that. This is a modified graph that I did in 2012 with Graham Lambert, a colleague, and it's been updated slightly and reproduced in a Lancet World Health paper by Pri Bandara and David Carpenter in December 2018. And I've modified it again slightly because actually this area was slightly misleading. The bulk of the graph is the sort of exposure we get doing our jobs, not using a cell phone, but this is just outside in the environment, in towns, wherever. So 100 years ago, 120 years ago, the background level was this green level at the bottom. So down here we've got medium wave, long wave, medium wave broadcast radio. Here we've got shortwave radio, FM, VHF radio, television, and mobile phones and Wi-Fi, where you've got these bands here, primarily, both mobile phones and Wi-Fi. And the levels went up by 1950s. They went up again by the 1980s. The data's put together from a wide variety of sources. It's not 100%, but it's pretty close to being reasonably accurate. And then that was what we were estimating in 2010. Since then, this has got a bit higher and closer, and there's more in here. But what's really quite mind-numbing, really, is if you go from the level that's down here, this is in power flux density, watts per square meter. Up to 100 milliwatts per square meter, it peaks. It's 10 to the power 18. 10 to the power 18 times more than it was 120 years ago. The first radio station in the UK, in London, was in November 1920. And that's 100 years this coming November. So not only have we filled all this space, which was the cosmic quiet space, with radiation, but we've also put this very pulsing radiation in that we're getting with 5G, modern communication systems. In here, I've got occasional exposures because until recently, it was more like radar, point-to-point links if you happen to get in the way of one, microwave links. But there was very little above about 10 gigahertz that was the general public was exposed to on a daily basis. So really, although these are the sort of levels, it was actually only occasional exposure, whereas this area here is actually the time. Here's a good news for 5G. February the 5th this year, leading tyre company Pirelli has been the first world's tyre company to transmit information by 5G. And it shows how a vehicle fitted with a tyre and a sensor in it can transmit 5G data to the car and to the tyres to following cars in the area. And of course, to do that, it also needs a wireless power system to get power into each of the tyres in order to power the 5G electronics that's sitting in there transmitting the signal. So we're completely, the industry is really struggling to find the most ridiculous, in my view, applications, which will give us all eventually much higher exposure. What I find particularly galling is the amount of money that governments around the world are raising. This again is a recent February the 5th. Well, it's January, but some of it. The FCC have just got another $7.5 billion for selling the higher end. They've already sold off the 24 gigahertz bands. This is from 37 to 39 gigahertz and some in the 47 to 48 gigahertz bands. Now, none of this money is coming back into health research. There is really, as industry and government people have said, there's really nothing going on in terms of health research, biological research. There's no money available. None of the labs are doing it. There's going to be a replication or semi-replication of the NTP, National Toxicology Program work, but it has some, I've got some severe caveats about it, but it hasn't started yet anyway. Ramazzini is doing some quite good stuff, Ramazzini Institute, that we're helping to fund. But there's really no money around to fund the work, and yet governments are pocketing these large tax increases. When the Stewart report came out in the UK in 2001, it was launched in Westminster, and I was there. I was sitting next to an industry guy, and at that point, the Labour government had just had £20 billion sterling for 3G licenses. So I was chatting to this guy I knew quite well, and said, "What are they going to come out with?" And he said, "Oh, I think they're going to come out with a joint funding program, industry and government, to fund some research into mobile phones and microwave signals and health." So I said, "Oh, how much do you think they'll spend?" And I said, "Isn't that a bit strong? Because you're just already giving them 20 billion. He said, "Yes, but how much is the government going to spend? 20 million? It would seem really petty if the industry complained of another 20 million when we've just agreed to 20 billion for licenses." So he said it's probably something in that order. So what did the government come out with?
Alasdair,
3.6 billion.
uh,
Absolutely 3.6 million, not billion, 3.6 million. So we had a 7.2 million research program, which was fairly well controlled. A lot of the work that was done was very unlikely to find effects. We're just not spending the money on it. Governments are really as problematic here as the industry is. The industry is desperate. They've saturated the market with 3G and 4G, and they're now looking to find new markets. But governments really are also strongly to blame. Many years ago, I was at a Department of Health meeting in London, and I was asking, I'm talking now 30 years ago, why is it taking so long to smoking in public places? Because the cost of the health service is enormous. It's about 20 billion a year at that time. And I was sitting next to one of the chief economists for the Department of Health, and he said, "Oh, it's because we've costed the cost to the NHS, National Health Service, and we look at our tax revenue from smoking, and the tax revenue is about 50% higher than the costs of smoking-related diseases on the NHS. So we're in profit." But he said, actually, the really no-brainer is that smokers years younger than non-smokers. So we save 10 years of state pensions for all those smokers that die early, and they've paid their taxes during their working life. And I think we've got a similar situation with mobile phones, because the vast rise in glioblastoma multiforme is in the over 55s. And actually, I'm not sure governments are really worried about us older people. I'm coming up to 70 this year, and that's how I see it. And I think that's the sort of issue, really. I've got various other things I could deal with, but I'm happy to take questions, probably.
well, thank you very much. Any questions from the floor? Yes, Min?
Hello, Philips. Can you please describe how the 5G deployment is being done in the UK right now? What kind of towers, where they are deployed, and if people are reacting?
There's very little at the moment. There's a few towns with some experimental setups. I mean, the high band phones are really only just becoming available. They're putting the low band 3.5 gigahertz 5G in football stadiums and big areas like that, where there are lots of people who may be wanting to use the internet. The industry itself is saying that even if you get a 5G phone, 99% of texting and internet browse will be handled by 4G LTE for the next 5 years. The rollout of 5G is actually going to be, of actual 5G signals, is going to be restricted to people wanting to download high definition movies or having very high, so that's how they've actually, to start with, they said that 5G was going to cost a lot more for license, for users. They've stepped back from that because the people are saying, well, we've got adequate. So even if you buy a 5G phone, it won't be that much more for your subscription, but in fact you'll still be using 4G LTE for almost everything for the next 4 or 5 years, apart from maybe if you go to big football matches or things like that. It's very slow. 5G is going to be very slowly rolled out. We're not getting the lamppost masks yet and that sort of thing, apart from a few trials, which aren't working very well. The things I did say, but it was on one of my slides, but I didn't actually see it. We now know that ICNIRP, the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation, which of course isn't really, although it's recognized by the World Health Organization, it's not got a legal status as a it's a factor, an NGO. It's a club, if you like, and the people that sit on ICNIRP are invited by the existing people on ICNIRP. So there's no open elections to get on it. And as you know, it tends to be very conservative and only really regards heating. And they're restating that in their latest update. And in their latest update, they're allowing a doubling of exposures up to 6 gigahertz and a 4-fold increase in allowed exposures above 10 gigahertz. So the 20 and 30 gigahertz. And the reason they're doing that, their reason officially is that, oh, we found it's okay. You don't get heated as much as we thought. But actually the real reason is the tests were showing that 5G wasn't going to work unless they allowed these higher level signals. The sharp edges that the system needs to synchronize itself and work well were getting lost in the noise. And so they needed higher signal levels. So not only this big public experiment, I mean, it's almost a war crime on humanity, that we're rolling it out. There's been no work done on large-scale population exposure to 20 to 30 gigahertz. It's a completely new thing, and we're doing no research work to test it out. We're also about the effect on bees and on insects, which the insects in the UK have gone down, the flying insects that birds eat and bees have both dropped dramatically since 4G came out. And if we go up to the millimeter waves, up at 30 gigahertz, it's been shown that you can overheat small flying insects, and you get clusters of them around the base of the antenna, where they just basically have got fried while they were flying through close to the antenna.
Thank you very much for your insight. It is helping us for many years.
Okay. Thank you.
In which case, we will thank the speaker once again.
Oh yeah, I want to make a slight apology. It was a very rushed. I was only asked Sunday night, and I couldn't do any work on it yesterday, and I haven't talked about this area for quite a long time. So it was very not as good and as informative as I would have necessarily liked.
I think I can speak for everyone here that it was extremely well informed and extremely good. Thank you very much.
Very good.
Alasdair.
Thank you.